Hello. Today was supposed to be the church of tomorrow morning, but today we're going to talk about a little truth, and I am going to be limited in what I say. But if you want to see the images of the voice that you hear, um, I could always tell you that one would be the altered timeline, um, the other would be what European colonizers did in order to reap the benefits and the wealth that they got now and have been building on all these centuries and years. So let you hear some truth. Let truth be the authority. Stop listening to people who think they have authority and stop giving them your authority.
Luigi Mangione, Doctor Strange, because for better or worse, dude altered this timeline. We having conversations the powerful always feared us having, and beyond the broken healthcare system, we talking about the efficacy and utility of violence. We've been told all our lives that violence doesn't solve anything, but it solves problems for the powerful all the time, and it has since the beginning of the time. You got a rebellion on your hands, violence. A leader getting too mouthy, violence. You want to take them people's resources so y'all country can be rich? Violence. Now, what happens when the technology gets so good that the leaders can design systems that do violence for them without getting their hands dirty? Well, you have something like our broken healthcare system. See, by violence, I think they be talking about interpersonal brutality. When you actually perform up-close violence, that do make you different. If you got shooters in your hood, you know they are a whole different kind of cat. They got a whole different kind of trauma, and they act out in a whole different kind of ways. They are neurologically not the same as the rest of them. Like, based on the shooters from the hood, I could guess that if you an ISIS fighter, you're built differently upstairs if you can chop off somebody's head in 2024-25 up close. But what about distant violence? What about the person in, let's say, United States Air Force who could kill way more people than the ISIS fighter could because he knows how to push a button on a drone? See, upstairs, the drone operator probably built way more like you. He got the same kind of skill sets, probably had the same conversations. Y'all are culturally familiar since the violence is sanitized. But because the system makes the violence more efficient, the death is worse. And to me, that's the difference between Luigi Mangione and Brian Thompson. Both committed death. Let's be real. And murder is wrong. But to what scale are we judging the wrong? And if we weigh them equally, will we still be as outraged? And who doesn't want us to put them on the same scale? Civilization is based on groups of people solving their problems peacefully. But this is all based on a social contract. And if we got systems of violence, mass murdering people, it is those who operate those systems that broke the contract first. And within that contract, peaceful people done tried everything. People done write books about it, documentaries, tried to pass legislation, tried to get folks to discuss it, ran on it on certain platforms. Nothing. Yet the violence keeps going. And people will still ask, are you trying to legitimize Luigi? I'm like, are you trying to legitimize Brian? John F. Kennedy said that those who make peaceful revolution impossible then make violent revolution inevitable. Those who make peaceful revolution impossible are the ones who void the social contract that says violence is the wrong way to solve your problems. That's the first act of violence. I think one of the reasons why Americans is praising Luigi is because we used to willy-nilly mass shootings. Luigi didn't shoot up no babies. He ain't going no preschool. This wasn't Uvalde. This wasn't Sandy Hook. He went and took out somebody who was at the head of a system that created mass death. And now we got legislation on the table to solve the problem of the conflict of interest within the medical industry. Look at that. The Patients Before Monopolies Act is going on right now. How you got something that we're so united on that Elizabeth Warren and Josh Hawley is co-sponsoring the same goddamn bill? Of course, I hate that it had to come to this. But right now, it's on us as a society to make some good out of all of this bad. And if what comes to this is a more just, equitable, and fair health system, like the rest of the Western world got, so be it. The conversations are being had.
Now, what I want people to understand is that no one here is advocating for violence, okay? and we're looking for a peaceful resolution to everything. But look at most European countries. Do you think that they earned the wealth that they got, especially people like Leopold, King Leopold of Belgium? Okay, what happened here in America? And who were the plantation owners here? And how did they gain their wealth? And we're not talking about, a couple of thousand or a couple of million sometimes. We're talking about hundreds of millions.
There are many ways that European colonialism changed the world, but the most obvious is the huge number of lives that were lost in the name of growth and expansion. People in the West wanted to find resources, make money, save the uncivilized, and gain prestige. But in the end, it caused death, hardship, and violence for those who got it. Many of the lessons that should have been learned from colonialism seem to still not have been learned. The effects of colonialism can still be felt today, from murder to resource exploitation to loss of cultural identity. Remember that these are just a few of the worst things that happened during European empire. Oh, the terrible, sad, and painful Atlantic slave trade. That's a story for another time. The Belgian Congo, 1885-1908. In 1885, King Leopold II of Belgium took over a lot of Central Africa. He said he would make the Congo Free State more civilized and advanced. King Leopold, on the other hand, took advantage of the land and the people to get ivory, rubber, and wood. King Leopold wanted to show the rest of the world that his small country could be as strong as the big ones in Europe. Rubber brought Leopold a lot of money, and he personally ran most of the Congo until 1908. In the late 1880s and early 1890s, more bicycles and cars were being made, which raised the need for rubber, which Leopold gladly met. Africans were made to work for him. They were supervised by a rubber agent who sent them to the forest in groups and held their wives and children hostage. When the Africans didn't make their quota, they were punished harshly, usually by being flogged. As the need for rubber grew, men had to go deeper into the forest to find mature rubber vines. The Belgians also used slaves to cut down trees and make roads. Men worked so hard that they died. Their families went hungry, and many Africans ran away to the forest to resist. Leopold's men, who were part of a private military group called Force Publique, would just go after them and kill or cut off their hands or genitalia to scare them and make them behave better. After firing a bullet, the Belgian troops were told not to waste it and were told to bring back one hand. After a village rebelled, one FP officer said, "The commanding officer ordered us to cut off the heads of the men and hang them on the village palisades, also their sexual members, and to hang the women and the children on the palisade in the form of a cross. If a soldier didn't have a hand, he would either buy one, trade for one."
They would do this, and they would do and put up images of the body parts in the sign of a cross. Now, I want you to think about that. I want you to also think about what the first 3 minutes of my video was saying. You see, the violence is okay as long as it's the colonizer or the rich using it to get the things that they want. It's not okay for anybody to use it against them, but it's okay for them to go occupy a country, okay, take over that country, use the country's resources and labor for free, and when they don't want to do what they're asked of them, they are killed and mutilated.
Or cut off the hand of a live person to become his boss. Whole towns were destroyed, and women were abused while their husbands collected rubber. When people from outside the area realized what was going on, they begged Leopold to stop. For example, when George Washington William went to the Congo in 1890, he wrote Leopold a letter asking why there wasn't any civilizing, meaning spreading Christianity, going on, and accusing him of being violent. He said that the Belgians were excessively cruel to its prisoners, sending them to the chain gang for the smallest offenses. This kind of government cannot be seen in any other country, civilized or not. Often, these ox chains eat into inmates' necks and leave sores that flies hover around, making the wound worse. This makes the prisoner worry all the time. A shikot, which is a dried piece of hippopotamus skin, is often used to beat the people. When it is put on well, blood usually flows at every stroke. But the horrible things that happen to troops and workers are nothing compared to what the poor natives go through when they are thrown into these terrible prisons here in the upper river for no reason at all. Because of anger around the world over the conditions in the Congo Free State, the Belgian government took over the colony in 1908 and changed its name to the Belgian Congo. Leopold was in charge of the Congo Free State and is said to have made $100 million to $500 million. However, up to 10 million Africans died during his rule. British India and the famines, 1865-1943. To be clear, India, which at the time included what are now Bangladesh and Pakistan, went through many famines when it was ruled by the British East India Company and the British government. Many historians disagree on what part the British played in the famines, but most agree that the British policies, actions, and reactions during each of the famines made more people die. In 1865, there was a famine in Orissa, but the British government decided to ignore it until the British troops started to go hungry. India got rice and other supplies from the British in 1866, but it was too late for many people. Because of this, 1/3 of the people in Orissa died. The British also had the same attitude toward food when 4 to 5 million Indians died during the famine in Madras in 1876 and 1878. During the famines in India in the late 1800s and early 1900s, the British continued to send food to other parts of the empire, but did nothing to help the people of India. These days, the famine of 1943 is getting more notice around the world than the others. During World War II, the British exported more than 70,000 tons of rice between January and July 1943, which was enough food to feed almost 500,000 people. Parents dumped their starving children into rivers and wells because things were so bad. A lot of them killed themselves by jumping in front of trains. People who were hungry begged for the water that...
I did not want to show any images because of the brutality and in fact how it made me feel. But I want you to understand something. I don't see how people of color have so many differences and can't get along with each other when we've faced the same plight. And we all know this. So please think about some of the things that you have looked at other people of color and held them in low esteem. And your colonizer, you tried to be more like him when he was the one brutalizing you.
Million Aztecs who lived there in 1518 were still alive. The huge number of deaths was mostly due to sickness, fighting, and not having enough food. Boer concentration camps, 1900-1902. There were 2 Boer Wars in South Africa. The first one happened in the 1870s and 1880s, and the second one happened from 1899 to 1902. During the Second Boer War, which was also called the South African War, British troops captured Boers, who were Dutch and African, and put them in camps. What did the Boers do? Boers, which is the Dutch and Afrikaans word for farmer, lived in the Transvaal and Orange Free States, which are just north of South Africa, which was ruled by the British. The British were afraid that the Boers would try to take over all of South Africa when Transvaal and the Orange Free State joined forces in 1897. So that wouldn't happen, the British put troops on the line between British South Africa and the Boer states. In 1899, the Boers gave the British one last chance to get rid of their troops. The British refused, and in October 1899, war broke out. For the first 6 months of the war, the Boers were victorious, but the British had more guns and more people. The almost 90,000 Boer soldiers were no match for the 500,000 British soldiers. By 1900, The British had taken over both of the cities of the Boer republics and added the land to their own. Due to a rise in Boer activity, the war went on until early 1902. However, with the Peace of Vereeniging, the Boers were forced to accept British rule. During the South African War, 100,000 British soldiers and 14,000 Boer soldiers were killed in battle. The war's biggest death toll, though, came from the concentration camps that the British set up. The British took men, women, and children from the countryside of South Africa and put them in camps in both Boer republics. This was mostly done to try to stop guerrilla fighting. In September 1901, there were 34 camps with about $110,000 white Boers. As one tourist put it, the camps were terrible. The exile camp here is a good 2 miles from the town, dumped down on the southern slope of a kopje, a small rocky hill, right out in the bare brown veld, with not a tree in sight and no shade of any kind. Around 2,000 to 3,000 people died every month in some camps. By the end of the war, almost 27,000 men, women, and children had died because of how they were treated. This made up 15% of all the Boers living in both countries. There were also camps for black people, but they didn't make as much of a fuss as the camps for white people. Around 14,000 to 20,000 black people died in the British camps. Mau Mau Uprising, 1952-1960. During the 1930s and 1940s, when Britain ruled Kenya, the native Kikuyu tribe kept losing land and the right to farm it. The tribe stayed loyal to the British government, but there were growing opposition movements in Kenya. By 1952, a secret group called the Mau Mau was attacking the British. The British banned the Mau Mau, but they kept getting more members and causing so much trouble and bloodshed that they had to declare a state of emergency in 1952. Notable nationalists like Jomo Kenyatta, who would become president of Kenya, were in the Mau Mau. But after the state of emergency was announced, many of the group's members were arrested. This only made the Mau Mau commit more violent crimes against both British and Kikuyu people. Even though the British sent more and more men to Kenya, the Mau Maus kept attacking for another 8 years. The British began to do sweeps and capture both suspected and real Mau Mau members. They also used collective punishment on towns they thought were hiding Mau Mau members or were supporting the group. There were thousands of Kikuyu and people thought to be Mau Mau who were taken and sent to reservations or camps where abuse and torture was commonplace, as British guards used beatings, sexual abuse, and executions to extract information from prisoners and to force them to renounce their allegiance to the anti-colonial cause. There is disagreement about how many Mau Mau were killed during this time. The official number is $11,000, which includes 1,090 prisoners shot by the British government. During the 8 years of emergency, only 32 white farmers were killed. According to the Kenyan Human Rights Commission, however, 90,000 Kenyans were executed, tortured, or maimed during the crackdown, and 160,000 were detained in appalling conditions. Spain and the Incas, 1532-1572. In 1531, Spanish conquistadors Francisco Pizarro and Diego de Almagro came to what is now Peru and found a society in trouble. There had been a civil war between Huáscar and Atahualpa over who should lead the kingdom. The Inca were coming off of that. Even though Atahualpa won, he and his people still had problems with fighting among themselves. Aside from the fight for power, there were also smaller tribes in the Inca kingdom that didn't like being ruled by the Incas. With 80,000 men behind him, Pizarro met Atahualpa in November 1532. The meeting was calm, but both men planned to kill the other the next time they saw each other. Pizarro struck the Inca the next day and killed 7,000 men while holding Atahualpa hostage. The Spanish had a lot more weapons than the Incas, who only had spears and arrows and didn't lose any soldiers in the fight. Over the next 8 months, the Inca gathered silver, gold, jewels, and other valuable things to make their captors happy. It's not clear if Atahualpa tried to sell himself or if the Spanish offered to let him go in exchange for money. The Spanish happily took all of the rewards, but in the summer of 1533, They put Atahualpa to death. He was supposed to be burned at the stake, but he was gagged instead after he and the Inca decided to become Christians. When Atahualpa died, the Inca didn't have a head, which made them even easier for the Spanish to take over. Over the next 40 years, the Spanish slowly took over every Inca city and stronghold. In 1572, they took full control of the empire, even though locals were still fighting in small groups. Overall, the Spanish presence in the New World caused a lot of deaths through smallpox and other diseases that spread quickly, as well as through war, especially when the Inca kept rebelling against them. In the late 15th and early 16th centuries, the Spanish killed between 50 and 90% of the people who lived in the Andes mountain area of South America. The British and Australian Aboriginal massacres, 1790s, 1890s. Between the late 1700s and early 1800s, people from both the Netherlands and Great Britain came to Australia to settle. However, only the British stayed and chose to colonize the island. When British ships came to New South Wales in 1788 to start a settlement, they got along well with the native Aboriginal people at first. Aboriginal people's lives were getting more and more messed up by Europeans, so resistance groups formed. Britain, on the other hand, kept using New South Wales as a prison colony, moving groups of criminals to the edges of the empire to get rid of them. From 1788 to 1823, most British people who came to Australia were criminals or sailors. Starting in 1793, though, free settlers began to come. Several groups of Aboriginal people were killed by British troops in the New South Wales area in the 1810s, 1820s, and 1830s. In 1816, 14 Aboriginal people were killed at Appin after they crossed into British territory in search of food. Between 50 and 100 innocent Australian natives were killed at the Waterloo Creek Massacre and the Mile Creek Massacre of the Kamilaroi people in 1838. A very hard year. The British slowly started to explore and take over more of the island. When they came across Aboriginal groups, they killed more of them. In Victoria, between 60 and 200 Aboriginal people were killed at Portland in 1833 and 1834. 20,000 Kurni lived in Gippsland in 1840. By 1853, there were only 131 left, and by 1857, there were only 96. Even though no one says they all died brutally, it's likely that hundreds did. The 1830s in Western Australia saw harsh raids against Aborigines.
So how do you reason with somebody that does not want to reason with you? Now, I don't want this to be all about death and destruction, but I'm just trying to give you some type of understanding of how European colonial and wealthy people came into so much of wealth and power, and how over several hundred years, they've used that money and that power to take over almost all these continents and countries. And if they don't actually outright own the information or the country, they take control in such ways as through economics and through public policy. So we're going to shorten this a little bit, but can't you see a parallel that whatever happened in India, in Africa, and over here in South America, happened right here in America? And we have to stop fighting each other and think of a way that we can live better lives. And a lot of times, the only way that I see is people of color have got to put down and stop with this mind control stuff that they've been feeding on for hundreds of years and understand the true reality of the situation. It hasn't been your people that look like you, and people of color that have misused you.
Portuguese, who were already losing power by the late 1600s, were their main rivals. In 1619, the VOC set up its business headquarters in Batavia, now Jakarta, East Indies. The company controlled trade in the area until it went bankrupt in 1799. After that, the Dutch government took over and changed the names of the islands to the Dutch East Indies. Through the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries, the Dutch controlled the East Indies until Japan took them over during World War II. The Dutch East Indies didn't want to be ruled by the Dutch again after the war finished, so they started a war for independence. In 1945, the Dutch East Indies, which would later become Indonesia, came out on its own. The Dutch and the other Allied powers didn't believe the story, so troops were sent to Indonesia to take it back under English control. Between 1945 and 1946, battles showed how strong and dedicated the Indonesian military was to the cause. As a result, there were several attempts to make peace. The government of Indonesia, which had just become independent, had a hard time getting started, but they were still able to stop the Dutch when peace talks broke down in 1947. In the 2 months that the Dutch fought to take over Sulawesi in 1946 and 1947, they killed about 4,000 Indonesians, led by Captain Raymond Westerling, who used what would become known as the Westerling method. The Dutch commandos would surround a village during pre-dawn hours, searching the residents and their homes. Anyone found with a weapon was shot on the spot and his house burned. The rest were herded into an open field. The men separated from the women and children. Any suspected terrorists were brought forward, condemned, and summarily executed. The worst retaliations of the war happened in the Netherlands after police action began in 1947. The Dutch sent 120,000 troops to Indonesia to keep peace and order during 2 big police actions. As one former soldier put it, "I didn't shoot them, the Indonesians, but I tortured and beat them up. They fell over when I put them out in the sun. I wasn't told to do it. You get used to it over time. Isn't it awful? I tortured people on my own, not because they told me to. I meant to do a good job." Indonesia became its own country in 1949. But it's hard to say how many people died during that time. The Dutch suffered 6,000.
Now, that was a soldier telling you that this was his answer and his way of doing things with the Indonesian people. Nobody had to give him orders for him to mistreat them, okay? He got used to it. So that frame of mind is that he got used to killing. He got used to torturing, mistreating them, treating them like less than human beings. Something similar to what we had as chattel slavery, right? So how do you bargain with people like that? Tell me. And on this documentary, it tells you that this is for educational and historical context, but we do not tolerate or promote hatred towards any group of people. We do not promote violence. We condemn these events so that they do not happen again. They shouldn't have never happened in the first place. And all of this is a whole lot of propaganda and rhetoric, because the same people who tell you that they don't promote hatred and violence, that's the way that they gain their wealth.
And deaths as a direct result of war. Indonesian casualties are almost impossible to calculate. Irish potato famine, 1846, 1852. During the Irish potato famine in the middle of the 1800s, about 1 million people, or up to 25% of the Irish population, died of hunger or illness. Another million people had to leave Ireland or were kicked out. These famines, like the ones in India, were not caused by the British Empire. However, British policies and actions made them worse and killed more people than they should have. In this time period, Ireland was part of the British Empire. When the potato blight first showed up in 1845, England didn't do much to help. In Ireland, potatoes were the main food. It is now known that a plant pathogen caused the crop failures of the 1840s. These failures robbed the Irish of food, feed for their cattle, and a good to sell abroad. Queen Victoria got rid of the corn and grain rules that made food in Ireland more expensive than potatoes. She also started shipping grain and corn to the country, but most people couldn't afford it. There wasn't enough, and many didn't know how to cook the new foods. People were being kicked out of their homes because they were poor, so owners started setting up charity houses and workhouses all over the country. During the famine, Ireland continued to send a lot of goods out of the country, which fed people all over the world at the cost of Irish men and women. Along with ending help programs like soup kitchens, the British government took a laissez-faire stance and waited for the economic and social problems to get better on their own. Amritsar Massacre, 1919. With the start of the Raj in 1858, the British Empire took direct control of India. When the 1800s and early 1900s came around, England put a governor-general, also known as a viceroy, in Calcutta and ran India from London. England kept hiring Indians for lower-level government jobs, but the rise of Indian nationalism and the rising cost of running the kingdom led to more Indians taking control of their own lives after World War I. Following the end of World War I, Indian calls for freedom got louder and sometimes even got violent. Indians fought with the British and gave them resources and men, but they didn't have a...
Enough is enough. But I want to tell you something. You look at Italians, you look at Irishmen, Indians, and how much we are hated when they used to look at them as less than us. And I'll tell you something. When they first came in New York and they said that they saw the Statue of Liberty, when they got in line for immigration, they were supposed to be lower than the Negroes or the blacks. And all of a sudden now they're integrated into the American society. And you know why a lot of that integration has happened? So that they could boost up their numbers. Okay? And then of course you know that most people, instead of fighting the system, will integrate into the system that has misused them. And that is how the Irish and Italians have done. And I'll tell you something. In closing, I want you to hear this again, because this creator has summed up something, and I hope you get to hear him and really hear what he's saying.
And like it or not, the American people have spoken. I'm about to start calling Luigi Mangione Dr. Strange, because for better or worse, dude altered this timeline. We having conversations the powerful always feared us having, and beyond the broken healthcare system, we talking about the efficacy and utility of violence. We've been told all our lives that violence doesn't solve anything, but it solves problems for the powerful all the time. And it has since the beginning of the time. You got a rebellion on your hands, violence. A leader getting too mouthy, violence. You want to take them people's resources so y'all country can be rich, violence. Now what happens when the technology gets so good that the leaders can design systems that do violence for them without getting their hands dirty? Well, you have something like our broken healthcare system. See, by violence, I think they be talking about interpersonal brutality. When you actually perform up-close violence, that do make you different. If you got shooters in your hood, you know they are a whole different kind of cat. They got a whole different kind of trauma, and they act out in a whole different kind of ways. They are neurologically not the same as the rest of them. Like, based on the shooters from the hood, I could guess that if you an ISIS fighter, you're built differently upstairs if you can chop off somebody's head in 2024-25 up close. But what about distant violence? What about the person in, let's say, United States Air Force who could kill way more people than the ISIS fighter could because he knows how to push a button on a drone? See, upstairs, the drone operator probably built way more like you. He got the same kind of skill sets, probably had the same conversations. Y'all are culturally familiar since the violence is sanitized. But because the system makes the violence more efficient, the death is worse. And to me, that's the difference between Luigi Mangione and Brian Thompson. Both committed death. Let's be real. And murder is wrong. But to what scale are we judging the wrong? And if we weighed them equally, will we still be as outraged? And who doesn't want us to put them on the same scale? Civilization is based on groups of people solving their problems peacefully. But this is all based on a social contract. And if we got systems of violence, mass murdering people, it is those who operate those systems that broke the contract first. And within that contract, peaceful people done tried everything. People done write books about it, documentaries, tried to pass legislation, tried to get folks to discuss it, ran on it on certain platforms. Nothing, nothing, nothing. Yet the violence keeps going. And people will still ask, are you trying to legitimize Luigi? I'm like, are you trying to legitimize Brian? John F. Kennedy said that those who make peaceful revolution impossible then make violent revolution inevitable. Those who make peaceful revolution impossible are the ones who void the social contract that says violence is the wrong way to solve your problems. That's the first act of violence. I think one of the reasons why Americans is praising Luigi is because we used to willy-nilly mass shootings. Luigi didn't shoot up no babies. He ain't go no preschool. This wasn't Uvalde. This wasn't Sandy Hook. He went and took out somebody who was at the head of a system that created mass death. And now we got legislation on the table to solve the problem of the conflict of interest within the medical industry. Look at that. The Patients Before Monopolies Act is going on right now. How you got something that we're so united on that Elizabeth Warren and Josh Hawley is co-sponsoring the same goddamn bill? Of course, I hate that it had to come to this. But right now, it's on us as a society to make some good out of all of this bad. And if what comes to this is a more just, equitable, and fair health system, like the rest of the Western world got, so be it. The conversations are being had. And like it or not, the American people have spoken. I'm going to have to start calling Luigi Mangione Dr. Strange, because for better or worse, dude altered this timeline. We having conversations the powerful always feared us having. And beyond the broken healthcare system, we talking about the efficacy and utility of violence. We've been told all our lives that violence doesn't solve anything, but it solves problems for the powerful all the time. And it has since the beginning of the time. You got a rebellion on you.
We've been sold a bill of goods, and we fail to realize certain things. I said I don't advocate for violence, and all I'm talking about right now is reality and truth. Look at the people who rained down violence on Black people ever since they got here. But they'll tell you in the good book, you don't use violence. Look at the laws that's been generated just so that we could be in distress, so that we would remain systematically, underprivileged and poor. What did they use in order to keep that in place? Violence, laws. See, the violence and the laws don't apply to them because they're the perpetrators. But often we are the ones that they say actually are the perpetrators. And we know better than that. And so wisdom dictates that you have to change your circumstances by any means necessary. And we've tried, and we've probably not exhausted all our nonviolent ways of trying to change the system, but we have to do a better job because right now I am seeing things getting a lot rougher for a lot of people, and especially Blacks. So I thought that this is something that you should see. Hopefully you stayed around and listened. Thank you.